All right, so you rolling?
I'm rolling.
All right. We're here with Senate Majority Leader Philip Baruth. Let's begin with, this is a big week for you. You were really the lead person trying to explain to your fellow senators what the McAllister suspension was all about. Is that part of the role of the majority leader, or was that part of your job as Rules Committee? What was the story there?
Yeah, I think in general it's fair to say that the Senate doesn't, the majority of the Senate doesn't like to be led. So often I don't see it as my job to corral them into doing things they don't want to do. I do see it as my job to try to persuade them where I feel strongly about something. So in this case, it seemed to me, I said in my presentation, it concerned the future of the Senate. That wasn't just rhetoric. I think if you had the precedent for having a senator be seated and voting with felony sexual assault charges, you could have a senator seated and voting on the other side of the chamber with the same charges. Have 2 senators, 3 senators. It's a line that shouldn't be crossed. So I spent 3 or 4 months trying to convince people that that was the case.
Okay. What was your goal and your hope the other day, and did it go as you had planned?
I think it did go pretty much as I had planned, and not just as I had planned, but Senate President Pro Tem John Campbell and the Rules Committee, a majority, including Minority Leader Joe Benning. The Lieutenant Governor had indicated that he was supportive of suspension.
Right.
So you had a lot of opinion leaders in the Senate trying again to convince people, not corral them. And part of that was a lot of work by John Bloomer to produce a smooth process, a transparent process, and a predictable process. Mm-hmm. And all of that pre-work managed to create a situation that wasn't comfortable by any means, but that was understandable and smooth.
The competing arguments seemed to be the other day. There were those that really felt very strongly about the presumption of innocence and the concern about the representation in Franklin County seemed to be the 2 arguments I heard by people that opposed the suspension. How did you get over those 2?
Well, as far as I was concerned, we weren't involved with the question of his guilt or innocence. I limited myself exclusively to what are the felony charges pending against him.
Okay.
So in other words, 3 felony sexual assault charges, 3 misdemeanor charges for prohibited acts. Given the nature and the number of those charges, I felt that was enough to suspend him. In addition, you have the problem of one of the alleged victims. Her allegation is that he used, in some sense, his power as a senator to bring her to the chamber, to bring her to the State House, to bring her to Montpelier as a legislative intern, partially for the purposes of producing unwanted sexual conduct. If the allegation is of that particular sort, if it's at that level, then I think we need to suspend just to err on the side of caution with the people we've been charged to protect.
Okay, but doesn't that, when you start getting into the nature of the allegations,
Yep.
which you just discussed there, how are you not in some way making a judgment?
Oh, I never said we weren't making a judgment. It's a judgment call. We weren't judging his guilt or innocence on the charges. The judgment comes into what you allow into the Senate chamber, what you allow in terms of risk for people in our care. So the analogy I used...
But do you really think that Senator McAllister was going to be preying on people here in the State House?
Well, and let me speak directly to that, because I did on the floor. Take a teacher who is accused of abusing a student. You don't say there's a felony allegation against that teacher, but we've known Bob for 10 years. We don't think there's a real good chance that he's going to do anything, so we're going to leave him in the classroom. Or let's say it's a cop, and there's a felony allegation. To make the analogy perfect, we would say there are 3 felony allegations with 3 different victims. We don't say, in spite of those allegations, I've known Don the cop for 10 years. I don't think there's a real probability. We don't get into, is there a real good chance? Is there a little chance? If there's any chance, you suspend the person. Administrative leave, it's sometimes called, suspension. You put them take them off the beat and put them on a desk job. However you frame it, you move them away from the vulnerable people in your care. To me, that was the paramount concern.
The reason I asked the question wasn't so much that, but I was thinking more along the lines of, with all eyes on him in this building, that there would be no threat to anybody else.
Well, but again, that's a probability. That's Mark Johnson figuring some odds, right? You don't think he would do that. But let's say that he did. Let's say that we had adopted Peg Fleury's substitute amendment, which called for us to do nothing until the trial finished.
Right.
And let's say that 2 weeks went by, and let's say, whether it's probable or not, that a page came forward and say that Senator McAllister did something that made her uncomfortable. At that point, aren't we morally, legally, and ethically culpable? I would say yes on all three.
Were you disappointed at all that there were 10 people that didn't agree with your view?
No. Look, it's never been done in history. We've never suspended, we've never expelled. And I think there are very good reasons for that. The difference in this case, I would argue, is first of all, we're in the modern era where male privilege is not hopefully what it once was. But beyond that, we're also in a time and place where workplace safety is something that everyone has written policies and laws to produce. So we take this very seriously. The third factor that made the difference in a historic sense is that you had a senator who was accused, felony charge, of abusing a legislative intern. And with that direct connection into the chamber, I think people said this is a step too far. And so you had 2/3 of the Senate vote in favor of suspension, a majority of Republicans, 3/4 of the Democratic caucus. That's a very strong vote.
If it had not involved somebody that was working in any capacity here in the State House, would it have been a different outcome?
I don't know. I mean,
would you have cared less?
It's hard to say whether you'd care more or less. I think the case would have been tougher in terms of persuading people on the fence. So I think it's fair to say that. My feeling is legislators should be held to a higher standard. In this case, any other workplace in the state of Vermont would have immediately suspended, and then they would have allowed their procedures to run their course. But what we were saying was specifically, because we were legislators, some people, 10 people or some subset of that, were saying because we're legislators, that doesn't apply. And this goes back to your other question about representation.
Right.
So the representation of Franklin County was something that everybody agonized over. And well, we should. We're here specifically to represent constituencies,
right.
And there's a sort of sacred bond there. With that said, my argument is if you say that a senator, no matter what he or she is charged with doing, is going to be given the choice to step down or not, and that's going to be determinative, right? Nothing else will matter in terms of their constituents' ability to get represented. If
Right.
they say they're sitting there, then that's the only way their constituents can get representation. Then you've given the entire regulatory, self-regulatory power of the Senate over to that individual accused senator. And I think that turns the system on its head. We don't like the ability that we self-regulate, and we might have to discipline or suspend or censure a member, but that's our job,
Right.
every bit as much as providing representation.
I'm not going to ask you about every crime that is out there, but I'm just wondering, what's your thought process in terms of what crime somebody could be charged with that wouldn't trigger what happened the other day?
Well, I said that these were judgment calls,
Right.
and they absolutely are. So let me give you a example in the federal system.
All right,
So high crimes and misdemeanors, if you want to impeach a president.
right,
So you remember with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was accused of a variety of things. They boiled down to perjury and obstruction of justice.
right,
And the question was, did those rise to the level? That was the phrase everybody used. You must have said it 25, 30 times a day.
never.
Did those crimes rise to the level that would merit impeachment by the Senate, the U.S. Senate? And there was a long discussion. And those senators, ultimately, a majority of them argued that the charges did not rise to that level. So a majority did not vote to convict Bill Clinton in the Senate.
Right,
Any case for impeachment would be a judgment call by the 100 senators at the federal level. I would argue the same here. We're not going to be able to establish a one-size-fits-all rule that says X number of felony charges of X number indicates suspension.
right,
If, 5 years from now, God forbid, a senator killed someone, and there were 5 witnesses that he had killed that person, and for some unforeseen reason, the system allowed him out on bail or her out on bail, and they came and sat in their chair. Would we suspend a person who is accused of murder? That is a good question. I would need to see the situation to know what I felt about it, but I would imagine I would. Now, if Peg Flory on Vermont Edition yesterday with me, she suggested that we might in the future suspend someone for a DWI. I don't believe that. I don't believe the Senate would act in that way. We've had people who've gotten DWIs and we haven't acted in that way. It's hard for me to believe we would. So you know this as well as I do. Any piece of legislation that passes through this building that's controversial, people say if they don't want it to go through, they say you're going to get sued, or it's a slippery slope, or both.
right.
And so in this case, we had both those arguments made, as we did with GMO labeling or anything else, but we made a considered decision, and I was very proud of the Senate for where we came down on it.
You think he'll resign now?
I think the chances are greater that he will resign now. I think, in a sense, Senator McAllister was hoping and maybe gambling that the Senate would ultimately not act, and that would have, I don't know that it would have seemed like a vindication, but I think maybe he thought that would strengthen his position going into trial. I don't want to get into his mindset or motivations, but now it is, without doubt, his constituents are down a vote, and he can erase that problem like that.
Let's talk some money here.
Yep.
Again, another big budget gap and concern about the affordability of Vermont and whether or not more taxes, and that balance you guys seem to run into every year. What are your thoughts on that? How you deal with the gap?
Okay, let me give you an example. So the governor proposed a new program that I thought sounded pretty good.
Okay.
In other words, there is an existing program called Man Up, which puts money into the early education, higher education of lower income Vermonters, men in this case. And there were a couple of young men in the gallery who had benefited from this program, got on the road to an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree. They were given some support services by the Vermont State College system. All well and good, and I think it's a great use of resources. With that said, the governor said he wants to put $2 million into expanding that program and calling it now Step Up and having it apply to men and women.
Okay.
Still like it, right? $2 million. But my immediate thought is there are 4 programs we've put into place over the last 5 years. Early college, dual enrollment, the Vermont Strong program, Vermont Strong Scholars, and universal pre-K. All of those things are expensive. Some of them, the funding system is a little cobbled together and tenuous. And my thought is, if those are not stable and enduring into the next administration, I want to use that $2 million to shore those up before we start another expensive new program. Now, I give that as an example, but it's the same across the board. So the governor has said he doesn't want to raise broad-based taxes, so he's got a box around income. We've got this Medicaid bill that was not made clear to the legislature, in my opinion, at the end of the last session. We've also got the budget gap that is perennial.
Right.
And so the governor has said he wants to reduce existing programs to fill those things. So this $2 million is coming out of somebody's hide, and I want to make sure it doesn't come out of those hard-fought and hard-won great educational programs that we've done over the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm. Without losing people, can you just explain how difficult it is to try to put this whole budget puzzle together?
Yeah.
Because I think everybody says, well, just cut, just cut and make it
Right.
fit.
Right. Well, I did think it was funny. The Free Press had an editorial where they said, look, you have this budget deficit every year. So that's a strain on the system. It's a strain on voters. They need predictability. Business needs predictability. So why don't you, this year, raise taxes by more than you think you need to, or cut programs a lot more than you think you need to, and then you'll be okay next year. But just think if we said we were going to do that.
Okay.
We're going to go to the voters and we're going to say, we think we need to raise taxes about 20 million, but we're going to raise them 90 million just to make sure.
So we don't have to come back next year.
Right. I think people would look at us like we were from Mars. So what we're trying to do always is hit a perfect sweet spot to the extent we can, and we're doing it with predictions that are sometimes wildly off base because you don't know. I mean, look at your 401k, right? If you're watching your...
Let's not.
Okay. If you watch your 401k over this next quarter,
Yeah.
you're going to see it take a dive because the Chinese market is in the dumper.
Yeah.
And it's not that nobody predicted that. Some people did, but most people didn't. And so,
A lot of people didn't listen.
Right.
Yeah.
And so trying to do the same thing with state revenue in terms of room and meals tax and capital gains and all the other revenue sources, including the lottery and liquor, everything, trying to get that accurate enough so that we can say we need to raise this much and cut this much. It's always an estimate, and $1 million in our budget is a rounding error. So yes, we're off by 10 million or 15 million, but in the context of the massive budget that we're talking about, that's pretty accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And then yes, we have to do budget adjustments. With that said, let me just say one other thing.
Mm-hmm.
Tim Ash, Chair of Finance, makes a very good argument that part of the reason why we're experiencing perennial deficits is that our entire taxation system is built on taxing commodities.
Right.
And those commodities are now increasingly purchased over the internet, and we're not enjoying the sales tax revenue. That used to be a problem that was kind of theoretical, like, that could be a real problem someday. When you look at the Christmas shopping that was done this year, a massive proportion of it was done online because of Black Monday or whatever they call it, Cyber
Right.
Monday.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, we are going down not because of misplaced policies on our part necessarily, but because our entire economy, not as Americans, but as human beings, is becoming much more virtual. And the taxation system has not followed federally, nationally, to deal with that. So could we do more? Yes. And people have talked about various fixes for that. An internet sales tax that we actually litigate in court. And another would be taxing services, because we're much more a service economy now. Those are very tough fights to have. We haven't chose to pick them.
Not this year either, right?
Right, and that's on us. And I think going forward, we need to address that sooner rather than later.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it very much.
Absolutely.